Welcome back, everybody. Well, I got to tell you, our next speaker, I am very, very excited that he is here to present his research today. And he's going to be talking about one of ufology's most significant chapters remains as one of its most obscure. And what I'm talking about is in the early 1950s, a brilliant scientist and pioneer psychotherapist named Wilhelm Reich developed the cloudbuster, orgone energy devices. The cloudbuster was a simple apparatus that could actually be used to dissolve clouds, create clouds, manipulate weather. And I'm going to tell you a little personal story as a lead-in to our next speaker. I read about, well, I've always been interested in all this weird stuff anyway, right? So when I was a teenager, I bought all the books I could find on Wilhelm Reich and read them. And one day I was over at my friend Eric's house, and his dad said, hey, why don't you guys go out in the backyard and tear apart that old rusty swing set that's in the backyard so we can throw it away. So we were like, good teenagers. We went out there with some hacksaws and started tearing this swing set apart. So, on a swing set, you've got 4 metal tubes right on the sides. And so we took these gnarly old rusty metal tubes, and I said, hey, before we cut these up, let's make a cloudbuster out of them. And my friend Eric was enough into this weird stuff. He's like, yeah, that sounds cool. So we took a piece of plywood and cut 4 holes in it so that we could put the tubes in there and make a little frame, And we didn't have fancy stuff like BX cable like Wilhelm Reich used to make the cloudbuster. So we just took some 12-gauge house wire that his dad had in the garage, screwed it into each of the pipes, and then ran it in the garage and wrapped it around the pipe for a well that they had that went into the ground in their garage. It was as crude and simple a device as you could get. And we pointed it up in the sky. In the sky, it was a pretty clear day with these like nice, thick, fluffy clouds every once in a while, And we took this thing and we pointed it at one of them. And within a minute, 4 holes in the same pattern that we had those pipes in were punched in that cloud. It happened just that fast. It was like, oh, wow, this really works. And then we got a little scared. We're like, okay, well, we don't want to create a thunderstorm or something, so let's not mess around with this too much, And so we unhooked it and threw it away. But I'm telling you, personal experience is there's something to this, okay? As weird as it may sound, there's something to this. So, our next speaker is going to talk about that. There is a UFO connection very solidly with some of Wilhelm Reich's research. So he is best known for his UFO, UAP-related, right? Can we settle on one? I get that we can't say UFO anymore because it's too weird. Can we just say UAP and not say both of them? Yeah. It's just clumsy. UFO, UAP? UAP, okay. Is everybody okay with UAP? I am. Okay. Anyway, his related writings and talks and interviews and broadcasts was introduced to the life and work of Wilhelm Reich as a teenager, as a matter of fact. So join me in welcoming Peter Robbins.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon. Whoa, that's loud. And thank you for that introduction. I want to begin by thanking the folks that put this annual conference together for inviting me to speak. I've followed its progress for years now, and it's one of the few in the country that I've never had a chance to lecture at. Also, before we get going, it's important to remember that events like this, which are so well organized and so thought out and so well manned, that's only because of a team of dedicated volunteers. And without them, we'd all be home wondering what we're going to do this weekend. So can we take a moment and acknowledge them with a, thank you. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to a ufologist I never met, but somebody I had a lot of respect for. That's Lou Farish, who first started this conference, and also without whom we might not be here. The subject at hand is one that's close to my heart because, as mentioned, I first started to read Dr. Reich's work when I was a college student and still a teenager. And it was the first time I realized I was in the presence of a truly great mind that potentially gave me an opportunity to understand how nature functioned, and more to the point, how we become the people we are, the nature of the human condition, the things that govern it. Dr. Wilhelm Reich was the founder of a science that he termed orgonomy. And it's simply the science of how energy functions in the living and non-living realm. Orgonomy offers groundbreaking applications in fields as diverse as biology, psychology, meteorology, cancer research, human sexuality, child rearing, political science, and ufology, among other areas of study. I should also say that as I continued to work on this paper, even up until a few days ago, I thought, it's possible I will run out of time. And it's important that you have an idea of how Dr. Reich arrived at the point he was at in the early 1950s when he first engaged with the subject of UFOs. So at the last minute, I decided to change the title from what you see here to what you see here. If we run over, it will be on background material. And Nancy and the folks who've organized this conference have been kind enough to say that they will post an extensive paper of mine on the conference website. All you need to do is click on the picture of me, I guess starting tonight or something, and that paper will come up. And even if I am able to finish the talk, understand that it's purely introductory. The sweep of Reich's work and the discoveries that he made, his engagement with Albert Einstein in 1940, which I don't even have time to cover here, all make reading that almost seems like fiction. I should also say that every word that I'm about to say is absolutely documented. I have gone back over this material many times over the past 40 plus years, and in putting it together, I had access to Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, who was Reich's first assistant for the last 11 years of his life, to his daughter, another Dr. Reich, who was a physician in Maine for many years, to his granddaughter, Renata Reich Moyes, who continues to be a friend of mine and is a pediatric nurse in Maine, to Reich's biographer, and so on. So I work from print sources and archival sources, but also from the people that knew him back in the day. So, and forgive me for keeping my nose in the paper part of the time. There's just a lot of detail that I don't want to miss. However, some of Reich's findings challenge the basic precepts and physical laws of our existing scientific order, while its bioenergetically based critique of mystical and mechanical thinking seriously challenged and continues to challenge a lot of our ideas to this day. Reich's blast at Soviet-style communism were often dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a great mind finally unhinged, but a great number of his observations were hyper-accurate, some even prophetic. But it was his acceptance of UFOs as a physical reality that dealt his reputation professionally its most stunning blow. His observations and findings on them were published just after his death in 1957 in a book called Contact with Space. Dr. Reich, in later years, in his laboratory in Rangeley, Maine, which is now the Wilhelm Reich Museum, and very much worth visiting if you are in New England. Twice-a-year journal that comes out, scientific journal, published by the American College of Orgonomy in Princeton, New Jersey, and a schematic for a orgone energy accumulator, often called an orgone box, which is kind of poor slang for it, and we'll go into this a little bit later. This book made Reich two extraordinary enemies. One was Joseph Stalin, the other was Adolf Hitler, both of who knew who he was, understood that he was, in so many words, onto them, and had exposed what we call fascism, which most people think of as a right-wing aspect of behavior, that it was functionally identical on the left and the right. He termed it red fascism, black fascism. They come at you in two different styles. Soviet-style fascism in terms of, I'm dressing like a worker, I'm posing as a common person, but as George Orwell said in Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others. Black fascists, a la Hitler and Mussolini, the Nazis and the Italian fascists, you can see coming a mile away. And their actual character structure, the chronic contraction of their musculature, their inability to feel or to have any kind of grace in their movements, is part of that presence that we associate with, Nazis marching and that kind of thing. Cover sheet for Reich's last book, published a month after he died, in November of 1957, in an edition of only 500. A very rare book, but the Wilhelm Reich Museum has copies of it, first-generation copies. When you study the progression of Reich's scientific work, it becomes obvious that his investigation into the UFO phenomena was merely the logical extension of a common functioning principle that had guided him throughout his almost 40 years of natural research on how energy functions. It's almost gun sight straight from a study of how a one-celled animal splits and becomes a two-celled animal, to the worlds of human behavior, cancer research, weather modification, the origin of storm and galaxy formation, and ultimately on the question of what powered the unidentified flying objects that he was seeing in the sky over his property in Maine. Rangeley, Maine, a beautiful part of the state. In the early 1950s, Reich moved from Forest Hills, Queens, in New York City, to a rural area just outside of the town of Rangeley in rural southern Maine. He had lived in New York City since emigrating to the States in 1939, and it is in Maine that our story really begins. This home that Reich built was built with the flagstones from the existing farmhouse that existed there in the 19th century. Again, it's now a museum. And I have to say, I visited a number of times, as have some friends here. It is one of the most remarkable buildings in that it is integrated a living space, a library, clinical facilities, an observatory, examination rooms, into one homogeneous structure. So, the cloudbuster is a deceptively simple apparatus which, properly employed, is capable of altering weather patterns in the atmosphere. More, some of the weather modification operations attracted UFO activity, first over southern Maine in 1953, and then above Tucson, Arizona, when he did field tests there the following year. Let me take a little time here to explain what this is and how it works, because part of the mythology of Dr. Reich's insanity or not fully being grounded in the real world is based on a rejection of principles that he discovered in natural science that seem too simple. No moving parts, nothing plugs in. It's got to be a sham, right? Well, like was explained to you earlier, let me put it this way. When I was in the Boy Scouts back in the day, one of the things we learned that is if you get stung by a bee, you pack mud on it. Most of you are familiar with that. I mean, it's just common country sense, right? Our sense is that that mud is cooling it down, and that's why it feels better. In fact, the living energy in that earth is drawing the toxin to the surface. I remember growing up, my Russian emigre Nana, if we, my sisters, my cousins were staying over her house and, as adolescents breaking out or something, her way of dealing with it, especially if it was uncomfortable for us, was to take a potato and cut it in half. And you just hold it to your face. The sensation was that it was just cooling it down and you were feeling better. But once again, in fact, the natural energy in that living thing was drawing the toxins to the surface. With the cloudbuster, the thing to remember is that water is a natural attractor of atmospheric energy. Now, in the early 1950s, a lot of members of the scientific establishment were feeling challenged by, at this dark point in the Cold War, that sooner or later, atomic bombs were going to be dropping on the United States by the Soviets, and that we were going to be dealing with something called fallout. And a lot of scientists were experimenting in different ways to see how they might be able to deal with this. Well, none effectively. But that was one of Reich's ideas when he started. And what he discovered was that metal pipes grounded in water, a well, a pond, even a running brook, drew the attention, drew energy down to the pipes. And when the pipes were large enough, created movement in the atmosphere. In '53, there was a marked drought in the southern part of Maine. And Reich's idea was very simple but brilliant. The pipes were aimed east over the Atlantic Ocean and started to create movement. A drought, in part, is the air is still over the area and it's moisture starved. He created movement in the atmosphere coming in from the ocean, and published results on rainfall make it very clear that if you were to put, say, a compass point into Rangeley and spin it around, the drought was broken within that 15 or so mile radius. This intrigued him, needless to say. But that's the principle that it operates under. There is no written or anecdotal indication that Reich had paid any attention to the publicity surrounding flying saucers before this, which of course began in 1947. Even in 1952, when friends who were visiting reported seeing lights in the night sky that were not behaving like stars, even to the fact that in 1952, there was a lot of news coverage of UFOs. Some of you are very familiar with the photographs over Washington, D.C., observed by thousands of people in formation. He had his mind in other places. In November 1953, though, we know that he read one of the best books available on the subject at the time. Flying Saucers from Outer Space was written by the highly decorated Marine fighter pilot Donald Keyhoe. It was a bestseller followed by a number of other scientifically written UFO books. And Reich observed, he was intrigued by Keyhoe's observation that the maneuverability, speed, and silence of these unknowns repeatedly defied conventional laws of mechanical flight. At the time, he wrote, quote, "I had not studied anything on the subject. I knew practically nothing about it. But my mind, used to expecting surprises in natural research, was open to anything that seemed real," end quote. Following Keyhoe's book, he read E.J. Ruppelt's report on UFOs. Ruppelt, a then retired Air Force captain, had headed the Air Force's Project Blue Book. The book prompted Reich to note, quote, "The Ruppelt report on UFOs clearly reveals the helplessness of mechanistic method in coming to grips with the problems posed by the spacemen." He didn't hedge his language at all. The cosmic orgone energy. And let's stop for a moment here because we often get caught up on words and terms. Orgone, kind of a funny sounding name, but it's simply rooted in the word organism. And also, the Hindus called the same thing the prana. The Victorians called it the ether. It's the sea of energy which we exist in. Between us, it's not dead space. There's energy informing the atmosphere out into the far reaches of space. This was Reich's theory, and I think it's been proved repeatedly accurate. Anyway, he writes, the Ruppelt report on UFOs clearly reveals the helplessness of mechanistic method in coming to grips with the problems posed by the spacemen. The cosmic orgone energy, which these living beings are using in their technology, is beyond the grasp of mechanistic science, since cosmic laws of functioning are not mechanical, but what I term functional. The helplessness of mechanical thinking appears in the tragic shortcoming of our fighter jets to make and hold contact with UFOs, and making an observation really about character and character type. Being unavoidably outdistanced is not a flattering situation for military pride. The conclusion seems correct. Mechanistic methods of locomotion must be counted out in coping with the spaceship problem. I should also say that as I go forward in illustrating this narrative, a lot of these photos are stock shots. I don't have the photos, nor does anyone, of these things actually transpiring. Okay. One night, as he sat on the steps outside his home, something flashed by at a great speed, its behavior not suggesting a comet, meteorite, or shooting star. Reich reported the sighting to the Air Force Base at Presque Isle, Maine, the first of many sightings reports he would forward to them. In March of 1954, he sent the Air Force a copy of a manuscript he had written detailing his theoretical conclusions on them as spacecraft. Somehow, the manuscript made its way into the prosecuting attorney's possession when Reich was brought to trial 2 years later, and more about the trial later. Basic to Wilhelm Reich's understanding of the universe was the pervasive presence of energy, implying the possibility of life in space. At this time, Reich's questioning had come to encompass the galactic currents, the formation and destruction of star systems, and the origins of the universe itself. Along with his deepening involvement in cloudbusting, he now began a careful examination of the stars and set about to prove that some stars did not behave like others. Well, how are you going to do that? Being a free thinker and somebody who was not pinned to classical methods, he hit on nocturnal time-lapse photography. And what he did was he set a 35mm camera at dark on a tripod, aimed at the sky with its shutter open. And the experiment yielded unexpected results. What happened was some of the stars did not produce the white lines caused by the Earth's rotation. These stars simply vanished, indicating that they were something else. He now began to wonder in earnest what they might be, and specifically what they were doing over Maine. That is Dr. Reich at a cloudbuster. On October 5th and 6th, 3 large yellow UFOs hung low over the southern horizon, with another hovering over the observatory on Reich's property. The scientists had to wonder if these craft had harnessed the sea of energy pervading the universe, and if so, what might be the effect of training a cloudbuster on them. October 10th, a large reddish UFO appeared, I have a cloud instead, just to the south of the property. The cloudbuster was trained on it and it moved. The unknown became less red as the device kept its aim, then moved higher, and later sank down below the horizon. Shortly thereafter, a second UFO appeared to be in the west. After 2 minutes of direct drawing, it faded too, then came back, flashed, pulsated, wobbled, and moved in an irregular direction from south to north. There was for Reich the distinct subjective impression of a struggle. The unknown returned a short time later and again became fainter and smaller after drawing on it. The remaining 4 unknowns then removed themselves from the area. Reich wrote at this point, "I hesitated for weeks to turn my cloudbuster pipes toward a star, as if I had known that some of the blinking lights hanging in the sky were not planets or stars, but space machines. When I saw the star to the west fade out 4 times in succession, what had been left of the old world of human knowledge tumbled beyond retrieve. From now on, everything, anything was possible. There was no mistake about it. 3 more people had seen it. There was only one conclusion. The thing we had drawn from was not a star. It was something else, a UFO. The shock of this experience was great enough not to repeat such an action until 10 October 1954. While it may seem naive to some, like many immigrants escaping persecution, Reich loved this country in a way that no matter how much we love it, if we were born here, it's hard to appreciate. He thought President Eisenhower was about the greatest guy in the world, and he started to send reports directly to the president on his UFO observation. The White House responded by asking him in future to send the reports to the Air Force and the CIA, which he did. On October 11th, Reich organized William Moyes, a trained cloudbuster operator, and his son-in-law, to call the Air Technical Intelligence Command, ATIC, in Dayton, Ohio, and make an appointment to discuss the seeming disabling of UFOs the previous day. Moyes was in Ohio on his way to Arizona at the time. Reich had leased several acres outside of Tucson to do a definitive field test on how well the cloudbuster worked. And what he and his associates did was study climate maps of the United States and establish that the 2 driest locations were in that area outside of Tucson where it had not rained a drop in more than 5 years, and Death Valley. Death Valley was very impractical to work in, so they were heading out, a team of them with cloudbusters at the time. At the meeting, Moyes gave a presentation to several Air Force officers and a civilian consultant, which he considered a significant breakthrough in interesting a branch of the government in Reich's UFO work. Moyes continued to Arizona after leaving Ohio. Meanwhile, Reich, his son Peter, and several other colleagues were driving west as well. Each vehicle carried an appropriate assortment of scientific and laboratory equipment, each with a trailer-mounted cloudbuster in tow. Reich chose the Tucson area, again, for the reason that it was one of the world's hottest and oldest desert regions. No prairie grass grew in the area. It had not rained a drop over the preceding 5 years, and the riverbeds had been dry for almost half a century. So much so that homes had been built in them over the decades preceding without giving consideration to the possibility that it might someday rain again. Reich had leased the property about 10 miles outside of Tucson, and on October 19th, they arrived. Once they settled in, they commenced drawing operations, and I use that term drawing in terms of drawing the energy down. Drawing operations and regularly observing the atmosphere with their meteorological instruments. Records were kept in strict accordance with scientific method, and individual journals were also maintained. These were trained scientists, many with doctorates, but there was no romanticizing what they were doing. All of these records are still available, backed up by local weather records. Not a good photo of a marvelous book, and I want to make a bit of a digression here. Much to my surprise, a few years ago, my friend Jim Martin, a brilliant researcher and self-trained, in writing and researching a terrific book called Wilhelm Reich and the Cold War, was able to establish a most credible link between Dr. Wilhelm Reich and the so-called MJ-12 Working Committee. Many of you are familiar with MJ-12. It's been a controversy in the world of UFO studies since 1987, when the so-called 8-page Eisenhower briefing document became public, and the 1-page letter from President Truman to our very first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, asked him to proceed with all due importance. Declassified national security documents, as some of you know, confirm the reality of this highly secured group, but shed no light on its purpose or mandate. The link between MJ-12 and Wilhelm Reich came in the form of an individual named Lewis K. Douglas. Reich refers to Douglas briefly in Contact with Space as the director of the Tucson Savings and Loan, which helped finance this expedition. Reich wrote, his banking institution helped along during the entire expedition in a most friendly and cooperative fashion. Douglas also happened to be the director of research for the Institute for Atmospheric Physics in Tucson. And Reich's first meeting with Douglas dates from 1954, when Moyes had attempted to contact Douglas and arrange that meeting. But the suggestion to do so did not come from Wilhelm Reich. It came from a man named Charles Gardner, Jr., who was the executive secretary of the Advisory Committee on Weather Control for the United States government. Gardner was also the National Weather Bureau's liaison with the Institute for Atmospheric Physics, and had actually written to Moyes on March 21st, 1955, saying, among other things, "We appreciate being informed of your activities." More, Douglas was known to be very close, personal friend to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And like the president, and many folks don't know this, no reason you should, he had a pronounced interest in weather control. The Douglas-Moyes memo of July 14, 1954, only 10 days prior to the so-called Cutler-Twining memo, also, which discusses the MJ-12 working group by name, but not its purpose. General Twining, a name that's known to many of you in UFO research, in September of 1947, published a brief paper called An Estimate of the Situation that, among other things, had the indelible quote, "The phenomena reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious." He's also listed as number 4 in the MJ-12 membership. In the memo, Cutler informed Nathan Twining that a scheduled meeting had been changed and that the Special Studies Project would now be held during the already scheduled White House meeting of July 16th, rather than the following day as it was previously intended. Whatever the actual reason for this change, it ensured that the President of the United States would be at this meeting. Douglas was one of the most powerful men in America behind the scenes in American politics at the time, and he would have known about MJ-12 if it existed, and having been briefed about the July 16 White House meeting, would likely have developed a more serious interest in Reich's planned cloud-busting operations in the Tucson area. This would have explained the sudden change in attitude when, on July 27, 1955, Douglas sent a telegram to Moyes inviting further correspondence. Also, it was Douglas who hired Dr. James E. McDonald, the father of scientific ufology, to head the Institute for Atmospheric Physics in Princeton. We also know that Dr. McDonald, who, as many of you are aware, literally gave his life in attempting to bring the subject of serious UFO studies to the attention of official science, which we were definitely not ready for at the time. If any of you are not familiar with this gentleman, Dr. James E. McDonald, I can heartily recommend Ann Druffle's definitive biography on his life. But McDonald was aware of this activity and went out to observe the cloud busting. We can only speculate as to whether or not he and Wilhelm Reich actually met, but it's intriguing to think that they might have. Another thing that Jim Martin established in his research was that in the route traveled to get to Tucson, Wilhelm Reich went through Roswell, New Mexico, and very likely returned east through the same location, although we can't absolutely be sure of that. This from somebody who just dug this up in the course of doing his own investigation. That's great research as far as I'm concerned. Robert McCulloch, another trained cloudbuster operator, also assisted with the operation, while Reich's daughter, Dr. Eva Reich, acted as the group's physician. Work began at the end of October, and many UFOs were observed over the area during the night of October 31st and November 1st. By November 7th, continuing to draw from the atmosphere, aiming west, drawing from moisture over the Pacific Ocean. The moisture in the atmosphere had risen from the usual 15% to 65%, an unheard of humidity index over Arizona up until that point in terms of all weather records kept, I think, back into the 1880s. On November 7th, the first clouds were forming thickly and soon covered the sky, indicating rain. Then, without apparent explanations, the clouds began to decompose. That evening, a bright, large UFO was seen coming up from the north. It moved slowly southwest until it stopped and hovered for several hours above the southern horizon. A connection between the dissipation of clouds and the presence of UFOs in the sky seemed unavoidable after this sequence of events persisted. Now, whether or not, and we're talking more than 60 years ago here, UFO technology in terms of their technology has changed or altered is speculative. But it does seem that whatever the equivalent of carbon dioxide, that there was something happening with those UFOs that was destroying the humidity in the air. And that's what they kept observing. By November 13th, the cloud-busting operation showed marked results again. The relative humidity had risen to 67%. And visualize this. The foliage on observable mountain ranges was now turning green. Prairie grass, seeds dormant for decades, was springing up in the several acres around the cloud-busting site. That's extraordinary. For me, it's one of the most thrilling discoveries, even more than when it did rain and broke all weather records in that part of the country, I believe to this day. Rain now seemed imminent in a location which had not seen a drop for 5 years. But that evening, the humidity had dropped again, 20 points to 47%. The next day, 2 bright, pulsating, flashing UFOs were seen low in the eastern sky. Upon direct draw, the first dimmed after an initial strong blinking, then remained dim. The second wobbled, then it too dimmed markedly. Suddenly, a third came from the east. Early the morning of November 18th, yet another UFO was observed on the horizon. And when I say observed, these were multiply observed and recorded in the journals of everybody involved, plus an awful lot of local people were seeing them. Diary entries, newspaper columns, law enforcement was aware of it. This was not some alleged phenomena. More UFOs continued to be observed in the direct relationship to the destruction of the relative humidity. The team's operations continued to draw a moist current from the west. It had now rained in like a gun sight straight line over the preceding several weeks. In Los Angeles, in Nevada, in Utah, with it coming closer to the area where they were working. On the morning of November 29th, Reich looked at the eastern sky through a 3.5-inch refracting telescope, observed a fully articulated cigar-shaped craft. He writes that his first reaction was to reject what he was seeing, but windows were clearly observed on the object and recorded in his drawings. The ship was observed on and off from December 1st through December 17th by Reich and others in his team, as well as independent observers. By December 14th, the atmosphere in the clouds of the base camp and in Tucson itself was oppressive and deadening. Reich had authorized one of his associates to take a very, very small amount of uranium and put it into an orgone energy accumulator, which amplifies the available energy to the point that it became toxic. His thought being that if he brought it into proximity of a cloudbuster, it might enhance, again, experimenting as he goes, its ability to produce the results it was after. But as we learn here, an associate, Dr. Michael Silvert, had transported a small amount of accumulator-aggravated uranium from Maine to the Tucson site. The material had to be towed on a cable 100 feet behind a hired plane, as its lead shielding was unable to contain its altered reaction. And this is where things get very unnerving for a brief period of time. About 4:30 in the afternoon, a huge black cloud formed over the Tucson area, gradually turning deep purple and somewhat reddish glow. The background radiation count in the area jumped to an alarming 100,000 counts per minute. The usual background count had been holding at 600 to 800 counts per minute. Both the atmospheric and Geiger counter reactions were likely the result, obviously, of the accumulator exposed radioactive material now in the vicinity. At this point, 12 Air Force planes flew over the camp, and their contrails made of water vapor evaporated like that. 20 minutes after both cloudbusters began drawing, the skies cleared. At 5:30 in the afternoon, 4 B-56 bombers flew in low over the site. Reich's subjective feeling was that this incident could properly be categorized as a battle. He also had come to feel that the exhaust from these craft that they gave off attacked the relative humidity. UFOs continued to be observed over Tucson, Arizona area throughout December, and footage of the weather modification operations was televised on the 20th. The accumulator-exposed radium had now been incorporated into the cloudbuster apparatus, and the extra excitation it caused in the atmosphere seemed to have been the deciding factor in their successful results. January 3rd, 6th, and 7th saw abundant and repeated rain in Arizona, particularly in the Tucson area. For the first time in memory, the streets were now full of puddles, the soil was saturated, snow had accumulated on Mount Catalina in the distance, and 2,000 families had to be evacuated from their perennially dry riverbed homes. The rain then moved on to Texas and New Mexico, while the Phoenix Valley experienced a rare fog. The real cause of these anomalous weather conditions was not lost on a growing segment of Tucson's residents, and a conference with local farmers, business representatives, and banking officials was scheduled for January 28th to discuss the problem and how to continue with the desert work after their departure. Reich's idea, which was increasingly being embraced by the local farming community, the bankers who had backed this expedition, and folks just concerned about the growing drought conditions in the area, would have called for part of Reich's team to remain in the Tucson area and train local people to operate this weather modification equipment. However, that was not to be. The following week, the Tucson Daily Citizen reported that good weather storms are promised, better range of prospects, and have been forecast recently. Cloud busting continued into March, as did the accompanying rainfall. All the aforementioned events were officially ignored by the Institute for Atmospheric Physics, which seems a little crazy, but that is what happened. They were busy, Reich quoted, they were busy with the new project, counting the droplets condensing around dust particles per volume of air. Scientific sarcasm. Another Institute for Atmospheric Physics project of the period involved time-lapse photography of jet planes' contrails. Reich had seen and reported aircraft contrails during the various cloud-busting operations and had observed their disintegration during operations in Arizona. He even wondered whether the Air Force had actually observed with such a problem in mind. They likely had. color movie film from the mid-50s, located by Jim Martin at the University of Arizona's Physics and Atmospheric Science Building, show Air Force jets being utilized in weather modification experiments. But at this point, the narrative abruptly changes. In 1947, a woman named Mildred Edie Brady, who we were able to identify as an extreme leftist, accused Reich of being a sex-obsessed medical menace, a totally unsubstantiating attack that nonetheless drew the attention of the Food and Drug Administration, who, feeling anybody that put forward devices that had no moving parts and that could benefit humanity and was obsessed in their mind with sex, had to be a fraud. And so they began to build a case against Dr. Reich. Unfortunately for them, it was very rough going. None of Reich's past or current patients, or any of those seeing any of the physicians he had trained in medical orgone therapy, had ever registered any kind of complaint with the FDA or any other agency or group for that matter. Neither Reich nor any of his associates had broken any laws, but the FDA remained undeterred in their efforts. Ongoing, they decided to bring to court the technology and were able to get an injunction against the interstate shipment of orgone accumulator parts. Orgone accumulators are simply a container. It can be as big as a shoebox or a room. The ones that most people are familiar with are about the size of an old-fashioned phone booth that somebody can sit in. And they're simply made of layers of organic and inorganic material. Organic material holds energy. Inorganic material, like metals, does, but much less so, and immediately reflects it back. The strength of an accumulator is based on how many layers of organic and inorganic material. Plywood and steel wool were perfect components, for example. Anyway, the laboratory in Rangeley, up until then, upon order, would have their carpenters manufacture these components and then ship them. From this point on, because of the FDA injunction, it was declared illegal. However, Dr. Silvert, who was a brilliant physician and mentioned earlier, inadvertently, and just one of those human things, shipped these components from Maine to New York, thus violating this injunction. And the laboratory was called to appear in court. Reich made a decision that his lawyers and his closest advisors advised against, which was realizing that he had an opportunity to appear in court. And he decided to take personal responsibility, as opposed to Dr. Silvert, who was responsible, with the naive, idealistic idea that he would use this opportunity to present the viability of his science. The judge would have none of it, declared him in contempt of court. It became a criminal case, which he lost, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Another accumulator. By this point, government agents representing the Federal Drug Administration came onto the property. And in the last months of the Eisenhower administration, confiscated over 8 tons of original hardbound literature, scientific journals, reports, many of which in no way referred to orgone energy, but on the flyleaf of a hardcover book, either on the back or mentioning just that term. Those 8 tons of literature were burned in government incinerators in Lower Manhattan. This is a low point in American history, but one we don't discuss. Reich appealed to the Supreme Court. They refused to listen to the injunction. And in November of 1957, 5 days before he was due for release, Wilhelm Reich was found dead in his cell. Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, who I mentioned earlier, who was his first assistant for the last 11 years of his life, and I'm proud to say was my therapist when I was in medical orgone therapy for almost 7 years, visited Reich in prison on a number of occasions. And he said he was working on a manuscript, which would have been his final book, that was tentatively titled Creation. Baker said he had a chance to read some of it, and that it was brilliant. It was dealing in part with anti-gravity equations, and do I have to tell you that that manuscript was not found in his cell when his body was? I'm not a conspiracist, but certain things do point to dark doings. A number of folks that I know and colleagues are convinced that Reich was murdered. Well, at least allegorically. He was a driven man. He was a type A character. He was a chain smoker. He continued with a heavy European diet for his whole life. He had a heart condition. So, on top of that, imagine somebody whose whole life had been dedicated to freeing human beings, to finding themselves behind stone and metal bars. I guess you could say he was murdered, but not in the overt sense. Orgone Energy Accumulator pamphlet, one of the documents that was burned wholesale. Core, Cosmic Orgone Engineering, Weather Modification, burned. Ether, God, and Devil, Cosmic Superimposition. Many of you have read things about Reich, and I expect very few of you have read books by him. I encourage you to do so. You will be surprised and moved. His writing is incredibly courageous. It's very insightful, and I don't know about you, but I'm a reader, and every 10 years I'll go back and read Huckleberry Finn again, or All Quiet on the Western Front, favorite novels. I reread Reich's books, and I always learn more from them. The Murder of Christ. Reich theorized that every time some distraught, put upon, powerless mother, exhausted in child raising, yells at an innocent baby, it's a murder of Christ. Reich in Handcuffs, Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, a pamphlet that was put together by Reich's editor, Lois Schweivell, who was somebody I knew fairly well toward the end of her life. Reich was entombed in this tomb on his estate in Maine, which he named Organon. The bust was done by an American sculptor named Joe Jenks. And in the background is a decommissioned cloudbuster. It's actually a very moving location, as those of us that have visited there know. In Reich's will, he stipulated that should we, human beings, ever reach a point in our development where we were not so intent on murdering each other over where the line was drawn in the dirt, and paying attention to the importance, the crucial importance of raising healthy children and creating childbirth in as warm and non-traumatic way as possible, that if there ever came a time when his technology was recognized for what it was, and cloud busting and orgone energy accumulators could be licensed, that all of that money would go into a trust called the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust. It exists, it's there, and we'll see how the future deals with it. Now we take a deep breath, and we jump back 60 years from 1957. Wilhelm Reich was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1897 and came of age on his family's rural estate, observing nature and natural functioning firsthand on a daily basis. Very important. He writes in his memoirs the naturalness of growing up seeing animals having sex, for example. This was not in anything that he carried into adulthood as a separate part of human functioning. And until he was 13, he and his younger brother, Robert, were privately educated by tutors who visited the estate. Reich's mother, Cecile, was very sensitive, artistic, and a piano instructor. His father, Leon, was Austro-Hungarian, rather emotionally distant, loving father, but at the same time characterologically rigid. Reich writes that when he was a teenager, an ultimate trauma for a young person, he walked in on his mother having an affair with a pianist that they knew, was horrified, shocked, confused, and ultimately not knowing what else to do, told his father, who confronted his mother, who then committed suicide. His father lapsed into terrible depression, and after 4 years, basically stood out in a thunderstorm until he got pneumonia and died, leaving him and Robert as orphans. He understood human suffering in a very personal way. At about that time, a little something called World War I swept in. Robert stayed with family friends. Reich joined the Austro-Hungarian military. This was the empire at the time. He trained as an officer. He was an artillery officer. He served with distinction in combat. And at the end of the war, returned to his home to find that he had no home. The empire was gone. The family's property was gone. He was destitute. But he was brilliant, and he wanted to study medicine, and he made his way to Vienna. Part of the reason he wanted to go to Vienna was, at the time, it was the most exciting place to be if you were a medical person interested in the human mind. This man, Dr. Sigmund Freud, was literally creating the modern science of psychiatry. And at the time, brilliant physicians from all over Europe were going to Freud and either being accepted or not into his inner circle to become that first generation of Freudian analysts. Reich did. He supported himself entirely through medical school by being a tutor to other medical students. And as soon as he graduated, he basically made an appointment with Dr. Freud. They met. Freud recognized his brilliance, and he joined that circle. Very quickly, he became Freud's first assistant and served in that position for over 5 years. Dr. Reich, center, first row to the right. After 6 years of practicing clinical psychiatry and the Freudian method, he went to Dr. Freud, and it's now 1929, and explained that in treating the patients that were sent to him, he had established that literally every neuroses, every dysfunction, every ennui, every case of human resignation was rooted in one way or another in unsatisfied sex life. Freud, at the time, of course, was famous for feeling, understandably so, that a great deal of human problems was rooted in sexual misery. But he refused to accept the possibility that they all were, one way or another. And they split. Now, at this point, the people in the inner circle began the myth, the legend, that Reich had gone insane. Well, what was the proof of his insanity as far as they were concerned? He left his position as Freud's first assistant. You got to be crazy to do that, right? Wrong. This was also a time when what was referred to back then as the Great Soviet Experiment, i.e. scientific communism, which we all know how that turned out. But among intellects and idealists, there was still the hope that somehow this form of government could offer a better alternative to working people. And the Communist Party of Germany, and then Austria, and then the Soviet Union invited Dr. Reich to set up clinics, what they called sex pol clinics, sex politics. The idea behind them was to meet with couples, working class couples, couples who worked in factories, whose marriages had problems. And the idea being that if they could restore proper functioning, they'd become better communists. Unfortunately for the communists, it did not work out like that. And in fact, couples that could be restored to what Reich termed a meaningful sexual equilibrium, their first priority was no longer the productivity of their factory, meeting their quotas, or being good communists. It was the love they had for their family, raising healthy children, and so the communists threw him out of the party, declared him insane, and Reich was a passionate anti-communist for the rest of his life. Reich in his late 20s. Now you tell me if this is a statement of a mentally unhinged man. Statement of Dr. Wilhelm Reich in 1927. This is what I am fighting for, the prevention of emotional human misery by the establishment of a normal and natural, that is, orgastically satisfying human life in the masses of people. Now, to any group or individual intent on controlling the lives and thoughts of others, these are the words of a truly dangerous man. The party never forgave him, and efforts to damage his reputation continued on, and again picked up again in 1947 with this specious article by Mildred Brady. Also, as a footnote, Reich's attorney, who later in life literally betrayed his client and gave information to the opposition to the state attorney that was used to help convict him, urged him to sue Brady. This was libel, first class, and he could prove it. He didn't do it. Other articles followed, and unfortunately, by that point, it was too late to correct. Freud again. Okay, Reich again. The year prior, 1933, Hitler had consolidated power in Germany. And by this point, both Hitler and Stalin knew who Wilhelm Reich was. Both would have preferred to see him dispatched. He managed to get through the border within days of its closing and emigrated to Norway, where he continued his work. This is him, group of communist sympathizers before he became arch-conservative. But I would have to say if he was alive now, he would probably be classified as an Eisenhower Republican, which is, I guess, a more progressive form of republicanism. Old sex poll publication, Reich, a wonderful anti-fascist poster. Reich in Norway, behind him, Ola Raknes, a close associate. In Norway, he focused a lot of his attention on cancer formation and what caused it. Obviously, there are hereditary factors, environmental factors, but he found that certain cancers took hold in individuals who were possessed by a great deal of resignation, who were not necessarily fighters, whose cancers formed in the most oxygen-starved, the most oxygen-deprived parts of their body. Continued to work. In 1939, he was invited to emigrate to the United States by the New School for Social Research in New York City and began to teach there in 1940. Now, among his books, This is the one that the official psychological establishment in this country says is still acceptable reading. It was written in the early 1930s. It still uses as text in training psychologists. But after that, they're told he went crazy, don't bother reading anymore. And it is a brilliant book. And it's something that, as a layperson, you can read too. People in Trouble. Reich writes here, I remember one anecdote of describing a riot going on outside his windows when he was practicing his therapy in Austria about 1932. And essentially government thugs, police officers who were intent on subduing a crowd that was protesting that they didn't have bread to eat. What he observed, that he remembered, and that you will remember too, is the hired hitmen, so to say, who were clubbing these unarmed protesters to a person had, the psychological term is flat affect. They had no real expressions on their face. Now think about that for a moment. If you're actively clubbing somebody, maybe you'd show rage or fear that you're going to be hit if you don't hit them. What goes on in a mind that's beating away at some poor human being and showing nothing on their face? This was part of his study of how the mass psychology, you take one highly neurotic person and you multiply it by the population. Look at Germany in, say, 1935. Hitler was on the rise. Things were getting better. Join the party. It's all the Jews' fault. Germany is going to rise again. And this entire nation embracing a form of madness that resulted in the wholesale murder of millions and millions of people who weren't the cause of their grief. Anyway, another very powerful book. This one, for me, one of the most important books of the 20th century that almost no one has read. An accumulator, a schematic, accumulator that I've used. If you are interested, by the way, in building an accumulator, really, it's the cost of parts. I think since the pandemic, construction materials have gone up. But for a couple of $100s, you can build one properly constructed that if you sit in 10 minutes a day, twice a day, you will feel refreshed. It doesn't make sense, except that it works. It accumulates energy. I built one years ago, not much bigger than a shoebox, for seed germination. I put usually a piece of BX cable, always with the wires pulled out, with a funnel. It would heal, it would help you move to, say, a sore throat more quickly. Most people, of course, well, I can't believe this, and I certainly am not going to take the time to replicate the experiments, but these are very replicatable, and this is accessible to real people. Anyway, Dr. James DeMayo, who probably did more cloudbusting on location than anyone alive, who passed away sadly about 1.5 years ago from cancer. His laboratory will continue to do their work. It's just outside of Ashland, Oregon. It's called the Oregon Biophysical Research Laboratory, but if you just Google OBRL, also known as Green Springs, they have a wonderful training program, a great library, seminar series if you live in or near that beautiful part of the country. And this handbook is the most responsible book ever published on schematics, on building your own accumulators. Again, the area of Rangeley, Maine, his home, and thank you very much for your attention.
Do you want to take questions or no?
Fine with me, as long as somebody repeats the question.
Okay, I can do that. Anybody have any questions? Please come up to our spot in the camera.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You just ended with the orgon accumulator and how it accumulates energy, but energy is neither created nor destroyed. So where is the energy being accumulated from?
Great question, and very Einsteinian. Energy is not being created or destroyed. What's happening is the layering, organic, inorganic, is accumulating. And the inorganic material is reflecting it back into the container. So what's happening is the available energy in the atmosphere, without any changes, is simply being more and more contained in a space, rather than equally distributed as it is outside of the space. It's just a function of that layering. It works, is all I can tell you. And I've used accumulators on and off since I was 20, and I'm in my 70s now. And I don't know it, so.
How would he feel about the events of the day?
How would Reich be responding to the
Today?
things that are going on today? Yeah.
I'm not sure. He was certainly ahead of his time back then. It depends who you ask, I'll bet. I'm not in a position to answer that. What do you think? I mean, a lot of what he was putting forward would still get in the faces of a great deal of people on Earth right now. For example, he saw salvation in terms of living a full life. One of the things I'm remembering right now is every book by Wilhelm Reich published in this country begins with the exact same quotation: "Love, work, and knowledge are the wellspring of our lives. They should also govern it." Now think about that for a moment. Imagine if your life and the lives of everybody you knew wasn't necessarily governed by, I hate my job, I'm in a bad relationship, I don't like where I live, the world's a mess, I'm powerless. My life is governed by love, the work that I've chosen to do, and knowledge, which I continue to acquire. That, again, makes him a dangerous person to people who want to control other people's lives. So I think he'd still be seen by many people as somebody to be dispatched.
That was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
I am just knocked out. Why are we not using these techniques for climate control?
I heard that loud and clear. Why are we not using this technology now? Dr. DeMeo, who I mentioned earlier, who is the only person to have ever received a bachelor's degree, in his case from the University of Kansas, where he posed to them that he would change the weather in the part of Kansas where he was studying in a positive way that could be verified by the farming community using only Reich technology did it. He was hired repeatedly by nations, by Israel, by France, by Eritrea, a nation in Africa, by Germany, to break droughts. And he did. But there was always a disclaimer he had to sign that he could not promote the fact that he used Reich technology to do it. Why? All of his work is connected. And if one is to acknowledge that his weather technology works, and it's inexpensive, and trained operators working together could make our deserts green around the world, if they did that, they'd have to acknowledge that his observations about the tragedy of much of human sexuality is real. That you think about Islamic terrorism. Imagine if these ignorant, miserable, isolated men who are so in despair about their lives that they believe this nonsense about becoming a martyr and going to heaven and having access to virgins as opposed to being able to get married and live happily, with somebody and have a decent sex life. It means that the world would have to acknowledge his uncomfortable findings, as well as the findings that would help. And we human beings at our worst are pretty scary. We would almost rather die in some cases than be proved wrong on something we find embarrassing or painful or reminding us of what we once had and lost or that we never had. And that is the reason I think that we're not using this technology. I've spoken at Reich conferences in this country, in France, in Rome. I've spoken at 3 Reich conferences in parts of Greece over the last 5 or 6 years. There are people there who are working, who are part of a community, small, who are following this work, who are doing what they can to raise healthy children, to keep their atmospheres clear, to practice methods in terms of simple human health or childbirth that's untraumatic or less traumatic, involving giving birth in water, for example. It's there. It's accessible. But the forces that be, overwhelmingly in this world, the people who we think of in terms of the great conspiracists, the ones who move the chess pieces, the ones who manage the puppets, the ones who run the place. If this were all accepted by the general world public, they would lose a lot of their power. So better to just continue the myth of his insanity, of his eccentricity, and that thing of, we see the same thing in UFO studies. It's functionally identical. You believe in flying saucers? Up until a few years ago, that was proof for a lot of people that you were mentally deranged. Flying saucers, little green men. You believe that you can control the weather, or that you understand cancer formation, or, it's wonderfully simple. And most of us, not us, but human beings, many of us are just sleepwalkers. We're doing our best to get through life, pay our bills, hope our kids, don't become drug addicts, that there's something in the social security system by the time we need it. We're not thinking about this. And we should be.
You may have mentioned him prior, but Eugene Mallov, what do you think of his work?
Are you familiar with Eugene Matloff and his work? What?
Not Matt, but Mallov, M-A-L-L.
Maloff. Eugene Maloff.
Oh. Not familiar. Not familiar.
You're not. He was a Reichian.
One more thing I need to learn more about.
Okay, this is more of a statement, but do you not think that maybe they eliminated him, hushed all the findings, except for people like you and others that understand? Maybe the government's using it. Maybe this is why we're experiencing such unheard of weather patterns, changes, storms in places that we've never had them, rain in places that just continues and deluges. Maybe they figured it out, maybe they harnessed it, and maybe they took, it's their secret. What do you think?
I'm not sure.
The puppet masters.
Can you repeat that question right up to me here?
It's really, I think that they have got his technology, and I think they're using it.
Oh, yeah.
They're using it
Yeah,
on
it's
storms
very...
and weather and,
Yeah.
and tornadoes that flatten communities where you've never had tornadoes.
What you're saying, of course, is that weather technology is being used against us. The whole chemtrail idea. And I still have mixed feelings about it, except that I know that regular vapor trails, they're made of water, and they evaporate very quickly. We've all seen vapor trails that hang in the sky for hours and hours and hours. And I remember once waking up I live in rural central New York State right now, and seeing some of these trails late at night as it was getting dark and waking up in the morning and seeing the vestiges of them still there. Nothing would surprise me less. I don't know if it's Reich's technology. There are chemical technologies and more harsh ways to change the weather, like cloud seeding, that for reasons we can only make our best guesses at. And the darker notions are that stuff is being dumped into our atmosphere to help control us, modify our own behavior, which years ago would simply have been seen as the paranoid ravings of conspiracy-minded people, and now ain't out of the question at all. Not at all. Again, whether it's Reich's technology, I don't know.
This is more like just a statement, but I think they're calling the chemtrails geoengineering now and cloud seeding, blocking out the sun to protect us, and also about the weather manipulation. We all heard yesterday how they said they had that meeting about Hurricane Katrina, and what was that, very shortly before it happened, and they did that with Event 201 as well with the coronavirus. Anyway, there is a book called Angels Don't Play This Harp, if you were wondering if there is weather modification, but I think that's a Tesla technology.
Yeah. I think you're probably right. I haven't studied it as much, but the whole HARP thing really freaks me out. There's some dark stuff going on there.
A question about the conflict with Freud with his trainees was pretty well documented, most notably with Carl Jung. Do you know if Reich and Carl Jung had any sort of interaction, relationship, or correspondence? And if so, what was it?
Did Reich know Carl Jung, and did they have any kind of a working relationship or
Reich and
friendship?
Freud?
Or Reich and Carl Jung.
Oh, I don't think so. I'm not sure they really interfaced. I don't think that Jung was involved with Freud in the same time period. However, for anybody interested in more information on this extraordinary relationship between Sigmund Freud and Wilhelm Reich, it's not an easy book to find, but it's a wonderfully interesting book, if this interests you. It's called Reich Speaks of Freud. And it's all archived in the Freud archives. And fascinating stuff as far as I'm concerned, but I'm an information geek. Any other questions? And I'm here to ask directly for the rest of the weekend as well.